Hi class, in this video I'm going to go through 5.2 and 5.3 Baroque music. Today we're going to be looking specifically about common qualities that can help you identify Baroque music and how to differentiate it from other time periods. I want you to be looking at what are the characteristics that make Baroque music Baroque music. So Baroque is the rise of secular music. Before this, we had a lot of sacred, meaning sacred of religion. Secular means of the people, so it has nothing to do with religion. We get more of this secular music during this time period. There's also a lot of art happening during this time period. It's very extravagant in the art and the architecture, in the clothing. It's everywhere. It's very extravagant. And part of it was to show off wealth. European courts became these cultural centers. And so the European courts, the lords and ladies and the royalty and all that goodness, they wanted to show their money. And so they did that through the arts, through architecture, through clothing, and through music. And it was all about innovation and making things new and better. And I can do this better than you. This was all about that. So what I want you to do is that I want you to go to Google and I want you to type in these years, 1600 to 1750. This is the time period for Baroque music. And I want you to look up some things that are happening in the world. What are some of the innovations? What are some of the historical events? And I want you to give me a couple examples of some things that are happening in the world. Let's talk about what it sounded like. First thing that I want you to remember is the word ornamentation or ornamented, either way. Music from the Baroque period is very heavily ornamented. Think about all the music that came before the Baroque period is like a Charlie Brown Christmas tree. There's not a lot on it. It's kind of small. It's music. Then we get to the Baroque period, and this is like Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. It's huge. It's big. It's super duper decorated and shiny. That is music from the Baroque period. It is excessive in its entirety, and it is gaudy, and you wanted to show off everything you could do. Remember, it was all about showing off. If you could do something really cool with your voice or your instrument, you figured out a way to put that into the music because you wanted to show it off. A lot of times what would happen is musicians would add ornamentation. So the line would be kind of, line of music, here's the melody. But instead of just doing that, the musician would be like, oh, I can make this better, and would add their own twist to it to show what they could do. So very rarely was the music performed. Did it actually sound like what was written? They had to do what they wanted to do. And I talked about this in opera as well, but once again, singers wanted to show off what they could do. So in operas, a lot of times they'd be like, I'm not going to perform that aria because that aria does not show off my skills. So they would be like, I'm going to do this one because this one shows my skills. So, We also had program music, which came from this fascination with nature. And so a lot of times program music would be like, this is the piece about this forest. Look at this forest. We're going to have a piece of music about the forest. And it was telling a story. And you would have to literally look at the program. That's why it's called program music. You would have to open up the program, and the composer would have a synopsis that went with the performance that you were expected to read so that you could understand the story that went with it. Sometimes it was really easy. You would just read the title. You're like, oh, okay, cool. I know what this is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about a forest. Got it. Sometimes you're like, huh? And you'd have to read the little synopsis. And so it was literally called program music. Usually about nature, not always. We also got the doctrine of affections. History is repeating itself. We did this a little bit with the Greeks. Now we're going to bring it back. It's the idea that they were going to only talk about one thing during this piece of music. So we're not going to be like, we're happy and then sad and then happy. No, we can have a happy movement, a sad movement, and a happy movement. But within that one movement, we are only going to be happy. Only going to have happy stuff happening. That came from the Greeks. We're bringing it back. So tell me, what word is not a synonym for ornamentation? Which one is not similar to ornamentation? Is it decorated, simplification, embellished, or adornment? Which is not a synonym? All right, so what did it sound like? We've talked about all this crazy ornamentation that's happening, but there were certain other very specific ornamentations or directions that were given by composers. One was called terrace dynamics. Vivaldi's Spring is very clearly shows this. Totally go Google that piece of music. Some of you have probably heard it before, the Vivaldi's Four Seasons, but specifically look at Spring. And terrace dynamics there was no smooth transition. So we'd be at forte, we'd be at loud, and instead of going a nice decrescendo, it'd just be like loud. And then we're gonna be loud again, yay, loud. It was very just like, think of it like a stair step. Instead of going like up a ramp to the different dynamics, we just went upstairs, just nice little jumps. We also get ornamentations. One very specific ornamentation that is very common to this time period is called the trill. And so the trill, so here's our note. We're going to be here, and this is our wave for the note. Doo, doo, doo. Instead of staying on that pitch, a musician is going to go a little bit above and a little bit below the pitch. And it's be nice and wavy instead of nice and straight and on the pitch. And that is a trill. So it'll be like, ah, and we're gonna go wave like that. And musicians love to do this because they're like, look how skilled I am. Look how much skill I have at my instrument for my singing. I am awesome. That's what that was about. We also get basso continuo. And so basso continuo, continuous. It's this bass line that just kind of sits underneath a piece of music and supports it, creates that kind of foundation. And it was usually composed of two instruments, but we consider it to be one instrument technically, which is a little weird, but just go with it. So basso continuo is typically harpsichord and string double bass. And they play the same part, they support each other, and it's kind of this bass line. Basso continuo, very just the bass. You can go look up the piece Jean-Philippe Rameau's Les Savages, and you can really hear that basso continuo piece supporting it. Don't have to go look it up, strongly recommend it, but there's a great example of basso continuo. So tell me, what would an example of terrace dynamics look like visually? So remember, like stairs, like a terrace, going up to the terrace. Is it forte to piano to forte? Are we going to have forte and decrescendo to piano? Or are we going to have a ritardando to a tempo? Now we're going to go on to the instruments. This time period saw a rise in instruments. Remember, we just had the Renaissance, we had the Reformation, we have a printing press. Now more and more people have access to instruments. They're being produced more commonly, so they're cheaper. Written music is cheaper. So more and more people are participating in the music making process. More people are literate, and they're gonna start making music. So the orchestras got bigger because there's more people playing them. And the bigger the orchestra, the more ornamentation, the more craziness you can do. More people, more you can do. So here are the instruments we have in our bass Baroque orchestra. We have our string family, which is violin, viola, cello, double bass, and viola da gamba. We have our winds, which was typically just recorder, oboe, and bassoon. We had our brass, which was trumpet, trombone, and no valve instruments. We didn't have valves yet. We had keyboard instruments, which is the pianoforte, which is what we consider now to be just the piano. We just call it piano. But back then it was called pianoforte because it could go easily perform a piano dynamic and a forte dynamic. So we called it the pianoforte. And sometimes piano is also considered a percussion instrument because it is played by the striking of the strings. If you open up a piano, there's a bunch of hammers in there and they're striking the strings. That's how it's played. Sometimes it's also considered percussion. We also have the harpsichord. This is extremely common in orchestras and just performances, chamber music, all that had a harpsichord. And it looks like a piano. It's smaller, but the inside, instead of having hammers, it's like plucking the little strings. So it's plucking it. So it has this very kind of stringy, plucked, ethereal quality because it's kind of plucking the inside. And percussion, we have the timpani. Notice as we go forward in history, this is going to get bigger, and there's going to be more instruments as new instruments are created and developed, and more people have access to instruments and are more and more literate, and things are cheaper and easier to get to. So notice this is going to get bigger. So what instrument would not be found in the orchestra? The violin, the guitar, the flute, or the bass. Now, not, little caveat to that, not be found in a Baroque orchestra. So some musical forms for this time period. We have a lot happening. Remember, this is all about innovation. We get chamber music, which had one player per part. Think of your chamber and your lord or lady. Your chamber is like your living room, and you've got a party, small gathering, probably actually relatively big. And you, in your chamber, you have a chamber orchestra, and it's probably like 4 to 5 instruments. So chamber music, one player per part, kind of small. We have a sonata. This is a solo piece, so single instrument playing their piece of music, sonata. We have toccata, which is all about improvisation. We get the fugue, which is this repeated theme. Go look up Bach fugues. They're amazing, and that's who you, if you want to learn more about the fugue, go look up Bach. And we get the concerto, and this is a soloist with an accompaniment. So it'd be like a violin concerto. It would be, you're gonna have the violin up at the front, and they're gonna be performing this beautiful solo while they have the orchestra behind them accompanying them. We get the suite, and this is dance music. Remember, there's no radio, there's no TV. That this was the rock and roll of the time. So dance music, this is what people were dancing to. They were having parties and having these chamber groups and these orchestras perform for their parties, and they were dancing. That's what they did. We have cantata, and this is a sacred form, and a couple of variations, but just remember it's sacred. We get aria. This can be found in both opera and oratorio. And remember, it's a sung piece, and it's the sung piece that tells the story. Recitative, this comes back from opera as well, but it's also found in oratorio, and it's very similar to speech, recitative, so just think that sounds like speech. And then oratorio, this is like the sacred opera. Yeah, that's sort of. So the difference between oratorio and opera, number one, oratorio is sacred, opera is not. Oratorio does not have all the sets. It doesn't have the scenery. It doesn't have all the crazy costuming. They're telling the story with the music. So opera-like, but we're just going to take out all the fanfare and the decorations, and we're just going to remove that and have just you focus on the music and the story. That's oratorio. Prime example of this is Handel's Messiah. You hear this a lot of times at Christmas time, and or we think of the Alleluia chorus, Alleluia, Alleluia. That came from Handel's Messiah, and it's a great example of an oratorio. Listening, I'm gonna play a piece of music. I'm only gonna play like 30 seconds of it. You don't have to listen to the whole thing. And I want you to tell me what type of music you think is. So is it a sonata? If it's a sonata, there's gonna be one person, one instrument. Is it a concerto? Meaning, is there a soloist with an accompanying orchestra or an accompaniment of any kind? Is it an aria? Is it a solo voice? Or is it a fugue? Does it have this repeated theme coming back? Remember, a fugue is typically played on organ, but it can be played on other stuff. So think about that as well. All right, listen to this piece and tell me what you think. All right, now that you've listened to it, answer in the question, what type do you think it is? Is it a sonata, a concerto, an aria, or a fugue? All right, class, remember, watch these videos before coming to the live class. We're going to use this information to grow more. We're going to work with it in the live class. So please, please watch these. And if you're here at the end of the video, you probably have. Make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're doing your readings, and make sure to remember quizzes are due on Fridays. Have a great day, guys.